Hello and welcome to This Week in X. This is the show where I help you get caught up with all of the new X-Men comic books out from Marvel Comics this week on February 28th. This is not quite a recap. I want you to actually buy the books if they sound interesting. What I'm trying to do is help you figure out if they sound interesting to you and help you catch up on some of the continuity that leads to the stories in the issues. This is actually a really light week of X-Men. There are only 3 books for us to talk about. AllNew Wolverine number 31, the limited series of Legion number 2, and XMen Blue number 22. But also I'll go over any of the X-Men collected editions out this week at the end of the episode. So let's get started. First up this week is AllNew Wolverine issue number 31. AllNew Wolverine 31 was written by Tom Taylor with art from Marco Fela, color art from Nolan Woodard, letters from Corey Petit, and a main cover by David Lopez. This all-new Wolverine issue is a single one-shot issue after a number of pretty deep arcs of 4 or 5 issues in length, and it actually mostly focuses on Gabby, who is also known as Honey Badger. So we probably, in order to get ready for this issue, need to catch you up on who Gabby is if you have not been reading All-New Wolverine this whole time. So this will have some mild spoilers for earlier issues of All-New Wolverine. In the first arc of All-New Wolverine, which, by the way, All-New Wolverine is X-23, Laura Kinney. She's taken up the Wolverine mantle since Logan, for a little while longer, is not around. So in her first arc of this title by Tom Taylor, she discovers a facility that is using her genetic information to make clones of her. She, of course, in turn is a clone of Wolverine. And the clones of her have been put up to doing some evil things. And ultimately, she has a lot of sympathy for them, although they're not all necessarily very sympathetic. And in the end, one of the clones winds up living with her long-term, and this clone is named Gabby. Gabby has very similar powers to Lara, but she also only has one claw in each hand, and she can't feel pain, which actually kind of makes it dangerous for her to be in some of these fights, because even though she can do some healing, she can't tell how hurt she really is. So Gabby has been a very tried and true sidekick to Lara, and she brings a lot of humor and humanity to this series. Lara on her own, even when she's trying to be like really human, she's stoic. She doesn't really necessarily know how to have fun or smile or kind of appreciate the company of others, because usually when she's in the company of others, it's either like some crazy kill squad or the time-displaced X-Men, which she doesn't really have a place in, but then she is in a relationship with Angel. So Gabby is the first time she's really just had kind of like a pal to hang out with, and it's very effective. I have my points where I'm like, really, like another clone of a clone of a clone of Wolverine, and kind of reject the Gabby concept a little bit, but there's no doubt in my mind that Tom Taylor has used her effectively to humanize Lara. Now, the two of them also at one point have picked up a pet actual Wolverine, and over the course of the series, Gabby has encountered Deadpool, and Gabby's being an actual child compared with Deadpool's childlike wonder at acts of violence has actually made them really appreciate each other. So that's where we pick up in All New Wolverine number 31. It's a one-off issue where Gabby heads out to take her pet Wolverine for a walk, and she winds up seeing a place that she feels needs some vengeance visited upon it. But rather than call Lara in, she calls her buddy Deadpool in instead, and we get a very funny, silly Deadpool team-up. Now, part of me wants to tell you that this is a little bit under the par we've appreciated from Tom Taylor so far. I got hit so hard by that last arc he wrote, Orphans of X, and this was just very light and fluffy by comparison. It almost would feel like a kid's comic, except for the fact that it's got, like explosions and guns, which for an older kid, that's fine. Like, I wouldn't necessarily read this to my kindergarten age kid, but it's actually relatively lightweight for a Wolverine comic and for a Deadpool comic. And Deadpool is at his really kind of silly, funny Deadpool here. He's not as scatological and he's not as Dadaist, but his jokes are there and they land. And he does a lot of situational jokes too, which are funny within the scope of the issue. But I keep coming back to like, was it good? And I think this is one of those times that like curmudgeonly old comics reading Peter, who wants like a big arc with impact, sometimes forgets the fun of just a fun, cute comic. The art in this is really adorable. It has the same consistent colors from the last arc from Nolan Woodard, who's becoming one of my favorite colorists at Marvel. And so it's very engaging to look at. It gave me a little chuckle, and it's got a little bit of heart. Is it silly for a one-off story? Yes. Do we really think it's a good thing that, Gabby is out there burning down buildings just because she has a little bit of a disagreement with them? Not necessarily a good thing. And is the ultimate twist of this comic, which involves a pit full of a very unlikely creature, and Lara and Gabby both kind of not caring that somebody gets hurt, which is a little out of character for them. Did that make perfect sense? No. But in terms of like, is this a fun comic that I think any comic reader from ages, 7 to 70 could pick up and get a little bit of a smile out of? Yes. I think if you were in All New Wolverine for the sheer drama of it, you probably want to start either All New Wolverine from the very beginning so you can understand who Gabby is, or, you know what, just pick up that last arc, Orphans of X, because it was great, and I think it really explains the Lara and Gabby relationship really well, so you could then move forward into these next few issues and know what's happening. Next up this week, we have Legion issue number 2 of 5. Legion issue number 2 was written by Peter Milligan with line art by Wilfredo Torres, color art by Dan Brown, letters by Travis Lanham, and cover art by Javier Rodriguez. Legion is Professor X's son, who has multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder, as we might say now. And those multiple personalities all reside in his brain, and each of them has a unique mutant power, to the degree that there's possibly an infinite number of them, as many as he could imagine anyway, and he can ultimately access any kind of power he would like if he can control the personalities. So many people know Legion not through reading comic books, but now through the new show on FX that debuted in 2017 last year and is about to have his new season debut in just a couple of weeks this year in 2018. It was fantastic. It's one of the best TV series that I ever saw, and it starts out with Legion, whose name is David Haller, being in some sort of mental institution, which he eventually is broken out of in the show. So you have that version of him in the show. And then the most recent time that we've seen him in the comic books was in a 24-issue series called X-Men Legacy in the Marvel Now period, starting in 2013. It was written by Simon Spurrier. And this was kind of a deep dive into the inside of Legion's brain, and it was extremely interesting. It wasn't my personal cup of tea. I don't happen to be a big fan of Spurrier as a writer, but it did really great stuff with Legion, and it felt like it actually kind of moved him forward, not just in that he gained some aspect of control over his powers, but we actually learned things about him. Usually Legion, whenever he appears, it's just like the X-Men hit a panic button. It's always just contain Legion, oh my gosh! And that, he had last been in the New Mutants run that started in 2009, maybe that started, and he was in the first arc, and he was part of the Fall and Rise of the New Mutants. He's in many classic X-Men stories, and it's just kind of like every time he arrives, it's kind of panic. And it was nice to have a series that was focused on him, where we could see him as a more sympathetic character. He's always sympathetic because he doesn't have control of himself, and he also kind of was left by Professor X, who probably should have been taking care of him his whole life. And so it's easy to be sympathetic for him, but then he's usually playing the crazy villain, so you have a little bit of a beware reflex. And that's not the case with that Legacy series. So I bring all of that up because this Legion miniseries, I just don't understand who it's for. And the story's mildly interesting. Basically, Legion is on the verge of having a specific personality, Lord Trauma, really take over, because some of the personalities wind up just inhabiting his body and taking over, and they very rarely have good aims. And so he's desperately trying to find somebody who can help him with that. And rather than go to any psychic X-Men, all of whom are in New York, including Rachel Summers among them, he decides he's really just got to go to this one psychiatrist who seems to have no specific mutant experience. And so he goes to her, and his solution in this issue is that he's just going to toss her into his psyche and hope for the best, because that's always turned out so well in the past. So as you can see, I'm already super jaded about this concept. It's just not that interesting. It actually feels like it's way more about the psychiatrist than about Legion, which a few years ago, I would have been okay, that's a cool concept, but we know who Legion is now, and the world knows who Legion is now from the television show, and so it just feels like such a waste. Why are we doing this when we could do something that is so much more interesting? And furthermore, not only do I think I don't think it really respects very much, if anything, of what happened in that X-Men Legacy series, but it doesn't really seem like it would be appealing to the people who watch the TV series, of whom I am one, but I know all this other stuff too. But it just it just doesn't match up very well. It doesn't sound like that Legion. It doesn't have the kind of kitschy appeal of that show. So it just feels like a total miss for me. Not that it's a bad comic. It's perfectly fine. It's okay. The art is actually relatively strong. Milligan, who can sometimes be a little bit dense and incomprehensible and unfunny in a British way that I guess a British person would say is funny, but I'm not British. He's fine here. I think the writing is great. It just conceptually is really kind of flaccid. So in terms of if you really love Legion and if you want to pick up a Legion comic book, read X-Men Legacy. And if you've already read the X-Men Legacy and you want to read more Legion comic books, you should then backtrack to read the first arc of the New Mutants, which just came out in complete collection a couple of weeks ago by Zeb Wells. And actually that complete collection covers all the way up to the final arc, which is also with Legion. So buy that book. And if you already got that book, then you can go further back in Legion's life. But I can't think of anybody that I would recommend this series to. Again, not because it's bad, but because it's just, who is it for? So it's got 3 more issues. Maybe we're going to get somewhere interesting. I'll keep reading. The final X-Men comic of the week is X-Men Blue, issue number 22. X-Men Blue number 22 is written by Cullen Bunn, with line art by Jacopo Comagni, color art by Matt Milla, letters by Joe Caramagna, and a cover by Nick Bradshaw and Federico Blee. This is part 4 of the Poison X storyline. Poison X is a crossover between X-Men Blue and Venom, where the X-Men wind up kidnapping Venom and taking him to space because they are trying to catch up with Cyclops, his father, Corsair, and the Starjammers, as they have been abducted. And let me give you a little bit of background there. So X-Men Blue, of course, follows the original X-Men that have been brought forward in time at the beginning of Marvel Now, at the end of 2012. So these are the 5 original X-Men, from somewhere in the area of like X-Men, 6, 7, or 8 in the 60s that were brought forward in time by Beast because he wanted to try to confront revolutionary Cyclops with, like, maybe if he saw their past selves, he would realize how far adrift they had come. But then there was no way to put these X-Men back, and so they wind up just living in our time. They've tried to go back repeatedly, and in a relatively recent arc, they do briefly go back to the point where they left, but they realize that they can't stay there at that time, although they are meant to go back eventually. So that puts like an interesting ticking clock on the series in a way that didn't exist before, and it actually has energized it a little bit for me, or at least energized me about it. Because now you have the sense that, like, they're probably going to go back. What's keeping them from going back? Like, how much else has to happen to them? Are they all going to lose their memories? How do they get reset back to the point that they can go back and be the X-Men that we know in continuity? Which previously the question was like, are they ever going to go back? And after, I guess 5+ years of that question, I was just getting a little bit bored with it. And so this question is a little bit more interesting. And I bring that up because in this issue, Cullen Bunn actually addresses that a little bit, even though we're in a totally unrelated arc out in space, because the narrator of this issue is Jean Grey. And it has her wondering a little bit, like, should she even feel at risk when the team is on these adventures, knowing that they've got this terrible fate in their future, that they've got to forget all of this and go back and just be the X-Men that the whole world has known. And, you might say that's a little bit of a Deus Ex Machina, like, oh, they can never get hurt, they can do whatever crazy thing they want to. But Jean isn't thinking about it that way because she's seen so many different versions of causality throughout the time stream at this point. She's like, can we really trust this? Are we really in danger? And, maybe we're all in danger. Maybe that's the reason eventually we get all sent back and can fulfill our role in the time stream. So I actually thought that was interesting, and it made this work for me a little bit more than the previous 3 chapters of this book. But there are some things that didn't really work for me. So the script of this book is like a little bit weird and rushed. Like at one point, Cyclops says to Jean, hey, we should break up into 2 teams. They're on the spaceship where the Starjammers are being held captive. And he said, half of us should go get the Starjammers, and then half of us should go to the cockpit. Except for then they don't break into 2 teams. Cyclops just goes off by himself. And I read and reread this page 3 or 4 times, being like, did I miss something? Did he run off before they could form the teams? But no, he just says it and everybody agrees, and then they don't form teams. So there were 2 or 3 moments like that in here where something happens and you're like, wait, did that make any sense? And you're paging back, and that was carried through in the art too. I don't think it was bad. It was actually relatively strong for kind of a lightweight, more cartoon influenced, younger looking series. But at the same time, there were just some art things that didn't really work for me. Like at one point, Iceman is sealing up a bunch of space pirates in ice, but the inside of the ice is just black marked with flecks, which made it look like Angel was tossing people out into the vacuum of space rather than tossing them to the ice for Iceman to seal up. There's a lot of backgrounds here that are just color wash backgrounds, the geography internally of the ship was not that well planned out, and so at certain points in the fight, there's kind of just gray in the background or green in the background because there wasn't a defined part of the ship to draw. So it's just an issue that kind of just feels it happened. I don't know that anything really intriguing intriguing happen for the X-Men, other than, I mean, it's nice that Cyclops gets to see the Starjammers because he had a great relationship with them when he was a member of the team in the Cyclops series that was written by Greg Rucka and John Layman in the late period of Marvel now, so that's nice. And I really did enjoy that Jean narration. The ending of this, I think, takes it kind of back out of X-Men territory and into Venom territory, which is fine because it's going to conclude in an issue of Venom. I don't really know how to describe it without giving you a massive spoiler, but there's been some recent Venom stories that have introduced some new elements into this like space epic scope of the symbiotes and like where they're from and what role they have in the galaxy, which I guess now that that continuity all exists, we might as well explore it. But the ending of this issue really leans heavily into that and less so about anything about the X-Men. And there's the chance that it's going to have a long-term impact on some of the X-Men, especially Jean, but I don't know. I guess we're going to have to read the next issue and find out. But for me, you know, as a mild Venom fan, this whole like everybody gets a symbiote, you get a symbiote, you get a symbiote, it's just too much for me. Like this issue, I think we see something like 12, 15 different characters that have these Clintar symbiotes on them, and it's just too much. We've diluted it too far. I guess I understand how Joe Quesada felt when there were too many mutants and he told Grant Morrison find a way to kill several dozen million of them back in the new X-Men, because that's how I feel about the symbiotes right now. I think we should kill several dozen of them. So if you've been reading this all along, definitely pick it up. If you're just reading X-Men Blue, I think you can probably just be picking up the X-Men Blue issues. Like, it's not like anything so revolutionary or interesting happened in the Venom issues. And after this, we're done in X-Men Blue because it resolves in Venom, and then the next issue of X-Men Blue will be following, I think, what happened on Earth without the X-Men while they're in space. So that should be interesting, and that is it for X-Men Blue number 22. There are 3 X-Men collected editions out this week, and one of them is actually a pretty big deal. The first one is Legion Son of X Volume 2 Invasive Exotics. This is not the big deal. This is a reissue of Legion's Marvel Now series, which was titled X-Men Legacy, which I spoke about a little bit earlier in the episode. Their fans have no way to know that that X-Men Legacy was starring Legion, who they now know from the TV show Legion. So last year, Marvel put out an omnibus titled Legion X-Men Legacy or X-Men Legacy Legion that contained the entire series, and now they're reissuing all of the original trade paperbacks with the Legion Son of X title on them so that people know where to find them. So you can still get all 4 of the original trade paperbacks pretty cheaply. You can still get the omnibus pretty cheaply, but you could also be buying this new book, I guess, and for some reason be waiting for volumes 3 and 4 to come out with the subtitle when, in fact, they already exist. So if you've been enjoying the TV show, I think that's probably the nearest comic run you can get to the strange serial-comic tone of the TV show, but it's not my favorite series ever. It's very British humory, so if you like that, you'll probably like it. The second collection this week, though, is the one that is really kind of a big deal. It is New Mutants Epic Collection, Curse of the Valkyries. And you're thinking, Epic Collection, like, they're great and all, but why is it such a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because for those of us who've been collecting all of these collected editions, this wraps up the collection of the first volume of New Mutants that started in 1983. It has the only issues that have yet to be collected from New Mutants. It's the issues that are from after Inferno to just before Cable arrives on the scene. With the addition of this book, we've got the whole thing covered. Not all in one format, right? We've got some of it in trade paperback, some of it in these big hardcover X-Men collected editions, and now we have one that's going to be in an epic edition, but it doesn't matter. If you're a book collector, you've got all of the issues, and that bodes well for also people who are reading on Marvel Unlimited, because usually Marvel Unlimited eventually catches up to have all the issues digitally that people have available physically, and so that probably means it won't be too long before Marvel Unlimited has all of New Mutants as well. That's a pretty big deal. I was doing the math, and it might be the first long-running, let's say more than 18-issue X-Men series from that kind of pre-trade paperback era that we've gotten completely collected. We still have 2 big gaps in Excalibur. We have 1, 2, 3 big gaps in Uncanny X-Men. We have lots of little gaps in X-Men Volume 2, some remaining gaps in Wolverine, but we've got none in New Mutants. So that's really exciting. I'm going to pick it up because I pick up all the Epic collections, but I'm especially picking up because now I can sit down and do like a New Mutants read in physical comics, and that is pretty exciting. The third collected edition out this week is a fresh one of the current running series of the X-Men. It is Weapon X, Volume 2, The Hunt for Weapon H. So if you're thinking about picking up Weapon X, you should probably pick up the first 2 trades first. I know I said it was Volume 2 and then I said first 2. That's because the crossover between Weapon X and the Totally Awesome Hulk, which is called Weapon H, actually is kind of like trade number 1.5 in this situation. And this trade completely directly follows that. It's not going to make any sense if you haven't read the Weapon H story. So if you like the Weapon X team, if you like Greg Pak, if you like Greg Land, who drew the first arc of this, you should be buying Volume 1 and then following it to get through the Weapon H crossover into this Volume 2 that just came out this week. And those are the 3 X-Men collected editions out this week. Next week is going to be a big week for X-Men comic books. We have the final issue of Iceman, we have Rogue and Gambit #3, and we have a rare week where we're getting 3 X-Men team books all in one week, because we have X-Men Gold #23, we have X-Men Red #2, which I'm greatly looking forward to, and we have the X-Men Blue team in Venom for the final issue of this Poison X crossover. So, oh my gosh, there's going to be a lot of X-Men next week rather. So, keep up. I'm happy that you watched this. I'm happy to hear your feedback on this. I really want this to help you figure out what are the X-Men comics for you. Whether you're somebody who just occasionally picks up an issue here or there because it's a really great issue, somebody who picks up whole arcs here or there, or somebody who just is like trying to figure out what is the X-Men about these days. That's what I'm trying to help you with. So if you have any questions, concerns, or suggested improvements that could make this a little bit more of that for you, please let me know in the comments, because I'm happy to hear it, and I'm so happy to be talking about X-Men here with you on This Week in X from Crushing Comics. Thanks so much for watching.